Citgo is not a Venezuelan refinery. It is an American one. It sits in the United States, runs on American infrastructure, sells into American markets, and lives under American jurisdiction. And that single detail turns it into one of the most valuable geopolitical assets in the entire Venezuela story. Most people hear Venezuela has the world's biggest oil reserves and imagined power. But modern oil power is not about what is underground. It is about what happens after the oil leaves the ground. It is about refineries, shipping routes, insurance, banks, courtrooms, and the currency system that turns crude into cash. Citgo is where Venezuelan heavy crude becomes money, or more accurately, where Venezuelan crude used to become money. Now, here's the part that sounds like a thriller. Venezuela is desperate for financing. It borrows, it pledges collateral, and at one point it pledges almost half of Citgo to Russia's Rosneft as collateral for a loan, roughly $1.5 billion. That is not a rumor. It is reported and filed. The stake is 49.9%. If Venezuela defaults, the logic sounds simple. Collateral is collateral. Russia takes the stake. In the public imagination, that immediately becomes Putin takes a U.S. refinery. That is when panic headlines start appearing years ago because the idea of a Russian state oil giant holding nearly half of a major U.S. refiner triggers a national security reflex. But the real world is never that clean. In the real world, collateral does not automatically turn into ownership when the asset sits under a different country's laws. The United States has something that is more powerful than oil reserves: jurisdiction, courts, regulators, licenses, and a system where money moves only if the system allows it. This is where the Trump story enters. The meme version is simple. Trump steals Citgo from Putin. But that makes it sound like Trump walks into a room and grabs a refinery. That is not how it works. The mechanism is colder. It is paperwork. It is licensing. It is the ability to make an asset legally exist, but practically unusable. Under Trump, the pressure campaign on Venezuela escalates. Sanctions expand, and once you sanction key Venezuelan state entities and you restrict dealings with them, you don't just punish Caracas. You change the entire legal environment around anything they own in the United States. Citgo becomes a hostage of the system. Now remember that Rosneft stake, it's collateral. Even if Rosneft wants to enforce it, the question becomes, can it legally take possession of that stake under U.S. rules, under U.S. sanctions frameworks, under U.S. national security review? And the answer is that it is not simply yes, it becomes not without permission. That permission is the real power in this story. So what happens next looks like chess. The collateral is there, the political optics are explosive, and Washington has a tool that can freeze outcomes without ever announcing, "We are taking your asset." It can simply make transfers impossible without a license. It can wall the asset behind compliance risks so severe that no serious player touches it. The result is that the Rosneft pathway becomes a dead end. And then another strange thing happens. Rosneft begins pulling out of Venezuela, not because it suddenly loses interest in oil, but because the risk profile becomes unacceptable. U.S. sanctions hit Rosneft's trading arm for its role in handling Venezuelan crude flows, and the entire arrangement turns toxic. Rosneft announces it is exiting Venezuelan operations by transferring assets to a Russian state-owned entity. This matters because it shows you something terrifying about modern power. You can pressure even a giant oil company not by fighting it, but by poisoning the channels it needs to function. Citgo is still sitting there, still operating, still inside the United States. And now, it is not simply Venezuela's crown jewel, it is a prize everyone circles, because Venezuela also defaults on debts and faces arbitration claims, and creditors begin trying to collect. Here's where the story turns from geopolitical thriller into legal war. In U.S. courts, a long process begins to auction shares tied to Citgo's parent structure in order to compensate creditors for Venezuela's defaults and expropriations. It is not one creditor, it is a crowd. Claims are enormous. Public reporting describes totals around the tens of billions, while Citgo's value is far lower than what creditors want. So the refinery becomes a pie, and everyone arrives with a knife, and Washington still holds the key because any transfer of control requires approval under sanctions licensing. Citgo is protected for years by U.S. government measures that prevent certain seizure actions unless licensed. That means even the creditors can't simply take it when they win in court. They still have to pass through the gate. Now pause and look at the shape of this. Venezuela's asset sits in America. Russia has a collateral interest that looks powerful on paper. Creditors have legal judgments that look powerful on paper. But the United States holds the practical switch that determines who can actually take control. That is why the Trump stole it narrative catches fire. Because from the outside, it looks like the asset is being moved around by decisions that are not made in Caracas and not made in Moscow, but made in Washington. And there is another layer that makes this story even darker. The difference between owning something and being allowed to benefit from it. Citgo can be technically owned by Venezuela through PDVSA structures and still be financially separated from the Venezuelan state. Money can be trapped. Dividends can be blocked. Management can be appointed under recognized authorities. The asset can keep running while the owner cannot fully use it. That is not a bug. That is the point. Under Trump, U.S. recognition of Venezuela's opposition leadership at the time adds another dimension to control, because it affects who is treated as a legitimate representative for certain decisions. The refinery becomes not just a business, but a political lever. Even without a single soldier deployed, the United States can influence the future of Venezuela's most valuable external asset. So where does the 20 billion headline come from? It comes from the scale of the fight around Citgo. Public reporting describes creditor claims collectively seeking around the low 20 billion range, while Citgo's estimated value is far lower, creating a brutal reality. There is not enough Citgo to satisfy everyone. And that creates a new kind of war, a war where the goal is not to own Citgo, but to control the auction outcome, the licensing, the court process, and the priority of claims. In that environment, even a partial advantage is worth billions. Now bring Putin back into the frame. The simple question becomes, if Rosneft holds 49.9% as collateral, why doesn't it take it? Because taking it is not just an economic act, it is a regulatory act in the United States. It raises national security review issues. It runs into sanctions risk. It requires legal transfer mechanisms under Delaware filings and corporate structures. And under the pressure environment that intensifies during Trump's presidency, those pathways harden into barriers. This is where the story feels like theft, even when it is not theft in the literal sense. If you are Russia, you can have a claim and still be blocked from exercising it. If you are Venezuela, you can own the asset and still be prevented from extracting its value. If you're a creditor, you can win a judgment and still need permission to collect. And if you are the United States, you can do all of this without ever saying the quiet part out loud, because you don't have to seize the asset to control the outcome. You only have to control the system the asset lives inside. That is the modern definition of power. So did Trump steal Citgo from under Putin's nose? Not in the cartoon way. There is no single moment where Trump takes keys off a table. What happens is more ruthless than that. The rules of access change, the risk of enforcement rises, and the refinery becomes a controlled space where Russian leverage stops being usable. Trump doesn't invent the system. He leans into it. He weaponizes visibility. He turns sanctions into a signal machine. He amplifies fear so markets and intermediaries enforce restrictions even beyond the written rules. And once that fear takes hold, it becomes self-sustaining. In the end, Citgo becomes a symbol of something bigger than Venezuela or Russia. It becomes proof that in the modern world, the most valuable assets are not always the biggest reserves. They are the assets that sit inside the right jurisdiction. And if you want to understand how a country can lose wealth without losing territory, you don't look at the oil field. You look at the refinery. There is one more layer to the Citgo story that explains why it feels less like a legal dispute and more like a quiet confiscation. It is the difference between theoretical ownership and operational control. In the modern financial world, the right to sign documents matters far less than the right to move money, appoint managers, and approve transactions. Citgo exists entirely inside this logic. The refinery continues to operate, sell fuel, generate revenue, and employ workers. On the surface, nothing looks broken. But the question is not whether Citgo works. The question is who is allowed to benefit from it, and that is where control quietly shifts. Once sanctions and recognition decisions reshape the legal environment, the flow of value changes direction. Revenues can be blocked, dividends can be frozen. Management structures can be altered through recognition of authority. The asset remains alive, but its economic oxygen is regulated. This creates a situation where ownership becomes symbolic while control becomes practical. For Russia, this is the invisible wall. On paper, collateral should be enforceable. In reality, enforcement requires access to courts, regulators, and corporate processes inside the United States. Every step triggers compliance checks. Every signature invites scrutiny. The cost of pushing forward rises with each attempt. Eventually, leverage turns into exposure. This is why the Rosneft stake never becomes power. It exists, but it cannot be used. It becomes a reminder that in the American system, jurisdiction outranks capital. A foreign state company can hold a claim and still be neutralized by the environment surrounding the asset. No seizure is required, only friction. The same logic applies to Venezuela itself. Even when Citgo technically remains Venezuelan, it is no longer economically Venezuelan in practice. Funds do not freely return. Strategic decisions are constrained. The refinery becomes detached from the country it was meant to serve. This is how assets are hollowed out without being taken. Trump's role in this stage is not procedural, it is atmospheric. His administration does not need to change every rule. It only needs to raise the cost of ambiguity. When uncertainty becomes policy, everyone downstream overcorrects. Banks shut doors faster than required. Lawyers advise retreat. Executives choose safety over profit. The system begins enforcing itself. This is why the story cannot be reduced to personalities. Trump is not acting alone, and Putin is not uniquely targeted. What matters is the structure that allows pressure to cascade through private actors without constant state intervention. Once activated, the mechanism keeps working even when the spotlight moves on. Citgo turns into a frozen prize. Everyone wants it, no one can touch it without permission. Creditors line up with legal victories that still require approval. Russia holds collateral that cannot be exercised. Venezuela holds ownership that cannot be monetized. And the United States holds the gate. This arrangement reveals something uncomfortable about modern sovereignty. A country can own resources, companies, and infrastructure, and still lose control over outcomes if those assets sit under foreign jurisdiction. The loss does not happen through force, it happens through process. The 20 billion narrative grows from this imbalance. Claims accumulate, values are debated, auctions are planned and delayed. Each delay reshuffles leverage. Each regulatory decision changes the ranking of winners and losers. In such an environment, timing becomes as valuable as ownership itself. What looks like theft from the outside is, in reality, a controlled narrowing of options. Russia is not expelled, it is constrained. Venezuela is not dispossessed, it is immobilized. The asset remains, but the space around it tightens until only one actor retains flexibility. That is why Citgo matters so much beyond its balance sheet. It demonstrates how wealth can be redirected without changing flags or borders, how power can be exercised without declarations, and how modern conflicts are increasingly fought in compliance offices rather than on battlefields. The refinery becomes a lesson. If you want to understand how influence works in the current system, you do not study oil geology. You study legal jurisdiction, financial plumbing, and regulatory permission. Whoever controls those elements controls the outcome. This is the real reason the Citgo story resonates so strongly. It is not about Trump versus Putin. It is about a world where assets only matter if they exist inside the right system. And once that system decides who may act and who may wait, the result is no longer negotiable. In that world, taking something does not require force. It requires patience. And Citgo shows exactly how that patience is rewarded. Another reason the Citgo case matters is that it exposes how time itself becomes a weapon. Legal processes stretch for years, sometimes decades. During that time, assets age, markets shift, and political priorities change. What looks like patience is often attrition. The longer an asset remains frozen, the weaker its original owner becomes. Time quietly redistributes power without a single headline. This slow motion pressure creates asymmetry. Large systems can afford to wait. States with reserve currencies can absorb delays. Corporations with diversified portfolios can move on, but countries under sanctions cannot pause their economies. Every month of uncertainty compounds damage. What is delayed long enough often becomes surrendered without formal agreement. Citgo also illustrates how private actors become instruments of state power without direct coordination. Banks, insurers, auditors, and law firms act to protect themselves, not to serve geopolitical goals. Yet their collective caution produces the same result as an official directive. Risk avoidance becomes enforcement. Silence becomes compliance. Power flows through incentives, not commands. Another uncomfortable reality is how legality replaces legitimacy. Court rulings, regulatory approvals, and licensing decisions appear neutral, procedural, and technical. But their cumulative effect reshapes ownership and control on a massive scale. Outcomes feel lawful even when they feel unjust. This is how economic domination avoids moral debate. It hides behind process. For observers outside the system, this creates confusion. Nothing dramatic happens. No tanks roll in. No flags are lowered. Yet value moves, influence shifts, and control changes hands. The absence of spectacle makes the transformation harder to resist. What cannot be seen is rarely challenged. Ultimately, the Citgo story forces a reconsideration of what sovereignty means. It is no longer defined only by borders or armies. It is defined by access. Access to courts, currencies, clearing systems, and regulatory approval. Without that access, ownership becomes theoretical, and theory does not generate power.